Welcome to Eastern Circle's Geopolitics Club, where we'll explore the past, the present, and the future of the post-Soviet region. This year's discussion season is devoted to the transition of power, and today's discussion is on Ukraine, 7 years after Maidan. Our program tonight will start with our usual introduction into drawing up the landscape of the Ukraine and Europe relations after the Maidan by our editorial team. This introduction will then continue into the discussion with our 4 distinguished speakers, and we'll finish up with a Q&A where you will have an opportunity to ask your questions. Please use chat and translation options if you need to hear us in French. Well, let's get started. Our editorial team introduction will open with a few thoughts on why Ukraine matters for the European Union by Eleanor Garnier.
Thank you. So Ukraine has been placed on the EU radar since the early 2000s with the shaping of the European neighborhood policy. This interest has grown significantly with the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which opened the door for active Western engagement in the traditional Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. However, since the beginning of this new European policy, there has been some divides among member states regarding the degree of integration of Ukraine with the EU. For instance, new member states such as Poland and Lithuania, for they have a common history and envisage a common fate with their neighbor, are more keen to push forward the agenda of the Ukraine integration, sometimes to the point of blurring the lines between accession and association roadmaps of the EU. This contrasts very much the position of founding member states of the EU, such as France, Germany, the Netherlands, who are much more reluctant to step in the Russian sphere of influence, for it could hinder their own bilateral relations with Russia. This has to be, of course, understood with the fact that on the other side of the spectrum, Russia still perceives EU integration as an equivalent of NATO integration, a military alliance, which is the main reason for precaution of older EU member states. For instance, the Dutch referendum on the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement in 2016 had the direct effect of adding an annex to this agreement, clearly stating that this agreement does not confer any prospect of military alliance with the EU. In parallel, Ukrainian-NATO relations, since its inception, remained a complicated one. Back in 2008, with the Bucharest summit, the Ukraine membership action plan was very much opposed by Germany. Recently, the desire to become closer to NATO has been the forefront of the Ukraine foreign policy. However, becoming a NATO member state is highly unlikely in the foreseeable future due to Ukraine's current lack of territorial integrity and its inability to secure its own border from outside forces. As of June 2020, Ukraine has become an enhanced opportunities member of NATO, which will be reviewed in the next NATO summit in 2021. But this is a much weaker alliance as the membership action plan and does not indicate a future accession of Ukraine to NATO.
Next, we will look at the key aspects of Ukraine-France cooperation by Christine Samandel.
The Ukraine-France cooperation state from the Treaty of Understanding of 1982. It bases their relations on friendship and trust with the prospect of building a peaceful and united Europe. In the field of defense, cooperation is at a standstill for the moment. There are no arms sales, no military assistance, no joint programs, no joint exercises. Only a handful of Ukrainian officers are historically trained in house schools. The explanation behind all this is quite simple. France is highly constrained by its necessary moderating role and neutrality within the normative format. As far as the economy is concerned, cooperation exists, to the tune of 2 billion euros, which is important for the country, but rather modest if we compare with Russia, 7 times more the same year. Economic cooperation has, however, taken another turn since the creation of the Joint Economic Commission, promoted by Bruno Le Maire, the French Minister of Economy, and Arsène Avakov, the Interior Minister in Ukraine, in the fields, for example, of security, transportation, and sanitation. Mainly, the Commission allows to promote French companies such as Alstom and make them obtain large contracts in Ukraine. Overall, we can say that Ukraine represents a real diplomatic interest of France, as it helps France to practice the task of EU diplomatic leader country through its role in the resolution negotiations. But in itself, Ukraine has never been a strategic focus for France, and the relations are governed by the true strategic and economic interests of France in Russia, including like this President Macron's visions of a new European security architecture in partnership with Russia. Furthermore, Ukraine and many EU member states perceive it as being detrimental to the European security and inappropriate in the actual geopolitical contexts.
I will now highlight the strategic importance of Ukraine to Europe as an energy hub. Historically, Ukraine has been responsible for the majority of the natural gas exports from Russia to Europe. However, that position, which also explains the level of European engagement in Ukraine affairs, has been undermined recently by two factors. Over the last 15 years, Russia has been striving to build more direct natural gas pipelines from Russia to Europe, bypassing Ukraine, which it has accomplished with Nord Stream and is trying now to further accomplish with Nord Stream 2, thus diminishing the importance of Ukraine for Europe. And the second is European energy strategy, if we can call it this way, and reflected on the national and also on the European level. And that foresees the gradual diminishing role of natural gas to lower the CO2 emissions by the European Union. Of course, these two developments have a great potential in the midterm and in the long run to undermine the strategic importance of Ukraine for Europe and thus the degree of attention by Europe to Ukraine. 7 years have passed since Euromaidan shook Kyiv. Kremlin-backed President Victor Yanukovich fled the country. Russia annexed Crimea and entered troops and weapons across the border in the east of Ukraine. The government of Ukraine still fails to control the border on the east of its country. It has lost control over parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. And there is no end in sight for the protracted conflict between separatists in parts of these regions known now as DNR and LNR, and the government and the army. We are going to discuss the outcomes and the way going forward since the power transition in 2014 with 4 distinguished speakers. We are going to start our discussion on Ukraine-Europe relations and its prospects with Ukrainian ambassador to France, Vadym Omelchenko. Vadym Omelchenko, before being appointed ambassador, led the Garshanin Institute, a think tank in Kyiv. Before that, he'd been also in service of the Ministry of Interior. He advised the Prime Minister and the Parliament of Ukraine on economic reform, on fighting corruption and crime. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being with us. And welcome to Eastern Circle.
Тому що я абсолютно не погоджуюсь з тим, що Україна асоціюється деколи з країною, яка щось просить, яка асоціюється з проблемами.
Car je ne suis et je ne serai jamais d'accord avec le fait que l'Ukraine est vue comme un pays qui plaide, un pays qui demande, un pays qui exige quelque chose toujours.
Я вважаю, що Україна – це країна сучасна.
Je suis convaincue que l'Ukraine c'est un pays très contemporain,
технологічна.
Technologiquement.
Тому що навіть незважаючи на конфликт на Донбасі, на окупацію.
Parce que même malgré, juste dans la lumière de conflits que nous vivons dans Donbass, avec la Russie.
Україна має такий справжній стрибок технології.
L'Ukraine n'arrête pas de montrer un vrai saut, une vraie explosion de technologie.
І дуже швидко рухається вперед.
Et avance avec un bon tempo en avant.
Тому я вас дуже запрошую, користуючись цією нагодою.
Comme vous avez compris, je saisis cette occasion de vous inviter.
Запрошую вас в Україну.
De venir en Ukraine, de connaître l'Ukraine.
Я вам обіцяю, що ви будете дуже здивовані, позитивно вражені.
Et je suis sûre, je peux vous promettre même que vous serez assez étonné, mais de façon très positive.
Дякую вам за увагу. Готовий відповідати на ваші питання.
Je vous remercie pour votre attention et je suis là pour répondre à toutes vos questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Omelchenko. I completely agree with the fact that we need to visit more Ukraine, and definitely positive surprises are going to await for people, especially coming to Kyiv or Lviv, very European cities indeed. Thank you very much for this keynote. We're now going to turn to our second guest, is the Deputy Minister of Economics and the Ukraine Trade Representative, Taras Katchka, who has had an illustrious career in civil service in Ukraine, having worked under several presidents and administrations. So somebody who is a professional civil servant and an expert in his field. Thank you very much for joining us. We are going to look with you, if you allow, at the importance of the association agreement. It was this association agreement of Ukraine with the European Union which had sparked the events at Euromaidan in 2013 and which had triggered all of the transition of power changes and eventually the dramatic developments with Russia. Association agreement wasn't so much so provocative because people have read it. It hasn't been even signed back then, but because of the symbolism that it embodied, the rapprochement with Europe. Of course, being an economic agreement, it has held a promise that Ukraine is going to be able to enter more easily European markets, that it's going to be able to trade better. But we know that behind each agreement of this sort with a very powerful economic union, such as the European Union is, there are always hidden clauses, and you can say they're not even hidden, but the clauses which are maybe hidden to a naked eye, which have to do with standards, norms, phytosanitary agreements and the like, and which can be interpreted as rather barriers to trade for the smaller exceeding part. What would you say? How would you assess this last we can say 6 years since the signing and then since the implementation of the agreement? How would you assess the progress? Has Ukraine, how would you compare the cost to Ukraine of this agreement, therefore the increasing exports from the European Union that it has received probably as well, versus the benefits that it could reap, in which areas and how?
Thank you. First of all, I think that, to talk about trade is very specific task because trade has its own taxonomy, vocabulary, and figures, and sometimes they are a little bit boring for those who are interested more in international relations and classical international relations. But nevertheless, I think that the link between basic choices in international relations and association agreement are indeed extremely interesting in case of Ukraine, because as you said, that in 2013, in particular, which was the violation of trust on basic choices in international relations and the drastic change of position of Ukrainian government at that time. So therefore, it means that the pro-European choice is into political order of Ukraine and just simple political statements during political campaign. So it's something which is really on the level of basic choices. And the biggest question and hesitation of 2013 was that Ukrainian economy is not competitive enough, or the Ukrainian companies are not competitive enough to trade with the European Union, and only our destiny is and was former Soviet Union state, and specifically Russia. And this hesitation actually was clarified and opposed by the practice, because starting from 2014, when trade regime which is envisaged by the started to be Ukraine, the number of Ukrainian companies and the number of Ukrainian products which we export to the EU are only increased. So for exporting our products to the EU, and last year it was more than 14,000 companies from every region of Ukraine exporting to the EU. EU, and we have whole range of products exported to the EU, starting from our classical export products like cereals, wheat and corn, and with highly technical equipment like trolley bus we export to Poland and Romania as well, and railway equipment as well. So that's almost every subway in Europe uses Ukrainian wheels produced in Dnipro. So that's also quite.
This is not intuitive. Thank you for letting us know.
Yeah, so that's why I think that this is our trade export to the EU is a story of really endless set of stories with small business, with eastern regions, and for example, if you combine these criteria, you may find producers of isolation stripes in Bakhmut, in 20 kilometers from the contact line, which exports this product to Germany, and makes sense to export from eastern part producers. So we really have a lot of examples of this kind. So that's the presentation could be endless, but at the same time, that we need to understand that the trade, the EU is not only statistics, and I think that for the moment the EU is our anchor trade partner, because more than 40% of our trade turnover is with the European Union. But at the same time, the EU exports to Ukraine more than Ukraine exports to the EU. Therefore, this trade is profitable not only for Ukraine but also for the EU, and it is quite clear. But what is interesting is that what next are the challenges of trade. Something what my colleagues who presented earlier talked about. The first is therefore sometime trade that, and this is ambition of Ukraine, and we see that in terms of complex decisions we have a lot of obstacles and delays from the EU, and we need to invest a lot in order to explain what that we deserve something what we request from the EU. For example, the last decision was on seeds which are used for growth of wheat and corn and other cereals. Usually we import from the EU and the company, and therefore so they invested quite a lot in improvement of our system of production of seeds, and it took almost 5 years to convince the European Union to recognize the quality of Ukrainian seeds, and finally it was done last year. And we have a lot of examples of this kind, and currently we are working with the European Union on conclusion of one of borest agreement ever. It's called ACA, Agreement on Conformity Assessment and Acceptance, and this is about standards, and standardization by itself is not interesting topic, because it's extremely boring and technical, and the international agreement on this topic is even more boring because it's highly bureaucratic one. But at the same time, this is a foundation for
very exciting document.
Foundation for our enhancement of our industrial cooperation and great involvement of Ukrainian companies into industrial production chain. And was that this was free movement of goods. And what we are talking about is that we will be glad also to be part of this system. And it took us more than 10 years to convince the European Union that we deserve serious attitudes in this area, because we modified our legislation, modified our institutions, and we are ready to conclude this. And at the same time, what we went through revitalization of Ukrainian industry. So, and what is interesting is that this new interest, growing interest to Ukrainian industry is driven by Germany and France, and in two different ways. Because France, for example, now, and French companies now extremely intensive and active in terms of industrial cooperations on railway. Alstom here in Ukraine saying that they have almost 60 counterparts here in Ukraine, which they believe are capable to supply spare parts for railway, for locomotives, for railway machinery, which is produced by Alstom. And it means that this is not only a legacy of the Soviet Union we have in Ukraine, Ukraine, but a legacy of Soviet Union, which went through transformation, successfully transformed, successfully modernized, and now capable to defend and to be really to deliver on requirements on the quality of this equipment. From another point of view, Germany, for example, is using Ukraine is more and more oftenly for what they call nearshoring, positioning of production, because what took place in 80s and 90s, that production was moved to China and Southeast Asia, and now it becomes more and more comfortable to place this production in Ukraine in shorter distance, in states with the similar legal framework, with similar approach also to environmental policies, etc., etc. And this is the big example, or let's say one of complex example, how let's say bureaucratic and absolutely unreadable association agreement and supporting documents help to reapproach and to integrate Ukrainian economy and Ukrainian industry to the EU. And I would like to complete my speech with two statements which are extremely important. One is, let's say, hostage of its success in trade, and now especially in agriculture, because success in our export to the EU agricultural products is now treated by most agricultural organizations in Europe, and unfortunately, especially in France, as a threat to the EU farmers. But in reality, what we see when we analyze our trade statistics is that in reality we are supporting and we actually helping the EU farmers to produce their products, especially when we are talking about supply of cereals and corn and wheat for the animal production, for dairy or meat producers. That's why we need also to be in, let's say, deep and open dialogue on how we complement each other in terms of agriculture, and we really believe that Ukrainian agriculture is not a threat, but rather a chance for the EU, especially in implementation of long-term strategies like farm to fork, which encourage more organic production, less usage of fertilizers or pesticides. Ukraine here is a really good...
Latin America, for example.
Yes. And Ukraine is a good partner for the EU and for France as well in terms of, let's say, achieving these goals. And the final element, as well as its continuation of the same challenge, is climate policy. Ukraine is, of course, maybe not a really, let's say, global champion of this policy, but at the same time we have substantively lower level of CO2 emission in comparison with the European Union. We are obliged and undertook commitments on environmental policy within association agreement. We are ensuring the same level playing field, and that's why we have an ambition to be aligned with the European Union in terms of climate policy, and we will have a really good dialogue on this. And it is as well might be interesting for French audience because of ambitions of Paris Accord and involvement in on climate and environment and other let's say top topics on our European agenda, and how Ukraine can help actually the EU to achieve these goals for 2030, for 2050, and it could be really good base for, let's say, speeding up our economic approachment, our economic integration as envisaged in the goals of the association.
Thank you so much. Indeed, agriculture is a holy cow of the European Union, as you know firsthand. And but what the good news is, of course, is those standardization and normalization agreements, which allow more cooperation in industry, and that's a very important, very big, of course, stride as a consequence of the association agreement. Thank you so much for this point. points. We're going to have more questions later, also on Russia and Russia-Ukraine economic cooperation at this point of crisis. Now, I'd like to turn to the head and founder and co-founder and the chair of the board of the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, Valery.
Thank you. Welcome everybody once again to our dialogue. Thank you, Anastasia, for such initiative, because it's very important, as Ambassador Omelchenko mentioned, to know better about Ukraine in France and abroad and around the world. I know this, we see many participants with English, so I speak English now. And, we are in Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, spend a lot of time to share the information about Ukraine from 2014 after Russian aggression. And now we have, I wanted to attract your attention, we have the page in France, in French, and we have Facebook in French. So if you want to have more information about Ukraine, please attend. I want to thank Tanya Garkova that's managed this work and this conference with you. And thank you all the team of Eastern Circle's Geopolitical Club that you focus on Ukraine. I know that you spend a lot of time to analyze Moldova, Georgia, and many other countries, but believe me, Ukraine, most important country in a post-Soviet area. Maybe you share with me this perception, because Ukraine, it's not because we have stopped Russia in the border of Europe with aggression. We spent a lot of time, we spent a huge resources. We finally, and the most important thing, our people sacrifice, just live their lives for defend Europe from this type of aggression. It's somebody name it hybrid war, somebody name it real war in the 21st century, but reality, now we face absolutely new reality. And Ukrainians who live their lives, 14,000, can you imagine? 14,000 Ukrainians live their lives from both sides of touchline. I mean, not only from Ukraine control line, but also from temporary occupied territory of Donetsk and Luhansk and in Crimea. And still, as Alexei Navalny, many Ukrainians still in Russian prisons in Moscow. So this is our common job, to bring to responsibility those who open aggression into the 21st century. And Ukraine plays significant role to secure Europe. Without Ukraine, every European, every French people, every French spent a lot of money, because you need in that case to improve your capability in the army, navy, and every field of defense in your country. And I want to thank France for intensify our military technical cooperation with Ukraine. As foreign policy advisor to the President of Ukraine and former Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, I remember how we develop our cooperation in this field. And now I can say that we have the significant changes. We have a very good and deepening cooperation in military, technical, and security term. Economically, I think we have a great opportunity to develop our cooperation with Europe. I will not focus on that. You've been asked to share my opinion about security, so I do that.
Maybe also just if we before we dive into security, because could we just before that we just turn our eyes into the internal policy, because that's what has been also very much with that support, so to say, initial support in 2014 of the European Union, by the European Union of Ukraine in its confrontation with Russia. There was initially a big wave of support, but also accompanied with a big wave of expectations, especially in the field of reform. And under Petro Poroshenko, several very important reforms were launched, including the anti-corruption reform, and which culminated in the creation of an anti-corruption agency, NABU. With judicial reform was launched, and the interior minister, police reform was launched as well. Yet they were launched and they were conducted, of course, because on the one hand there was a high demand by the civil society of Ukraine, but also there was a big spur by the Western partners to conduct those reforms in exchange for financial support. Now, after the initial kind of high hopes that the European Union had toward Ukraine, there was a disappointment, especially following a year and a half maybe into the conflict and into the reforms. And I really wanted to kind of zoom in on these reforms now, because when we talk about Ukraine and in the West, there is a lot of emphasis put on the role of Russia or the role of the West, enough support, not enough support. And how much has the Ukrainian government done to improve its own situation? Because the same reforms which have then been started under Poroshenko then have been stalled. And now President Zelensky was able to come to office pretty much riding on the same electoral promises, especially anti-corruption promise and cleaning up the house promise, positioning himself as one of the people, one of us, so to say, coming a new player. And this worked for the electoral campaign, yet it also reflects that yet the same struggle continues until today, and we do not see the end in sight. The defense reform, and it was kind of more a landmark reform by Zelensky, and also is launched for a reason. Could you please maybe shed light, since you've been, in politics and in the close to the administration during the Poroshenko times, why, in your opinion, those important, judicial, anti-corruption, police reform, so why have they stalled, and what is the chance of them being picked up again and succeeding now?
Well, we do not have enough time to share all this complexity of these reforms in Ukraine. But I want to remind you, I think the most significant reform in Ukraine was in 1994. Now, I used to be in that time in a group of assistants to the president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma. Leonid Kuchma, in that time, he was a real reformer. And I remember how we changed the situation from 11,000 inflation rate in Ukraine. It's like Zimbabwe in that time, to 10%. And this was absolutely new era, new Ukrainian currency, new Ukrainian businesses, new cooperation with friends. After that, many changes. So but I divided all this term for two important times: before 2014 and after 2014. Why? Because before 2014, our main economic partner, energy partner, was Russia. And I, in that time, was a secretary of strategic group under presidents of Ukraine and Russia. I remember all the meetings with Mr. Putin, or with all his assistants, and still this assistance works with Mr. Putin. So for me, absolutely clear that this was Russia who changed times. It was Russia who stopped our energy economic cooperation. It was Russia who opened aggression against Ukraine. And this closed us many things to doing with Russia in that direction. So we oriented on reforms, Western style reforms. That's why now in Ukraine, continued discussion. What is it? Is it Western influence or Western control under Ukraine? And when they speak Western, they mean not Russia. So this Americans, France, British, and all others. And the main discussion now in Ukraine still, and that's a pity, which direction for the future for Ukraine, geopolitical direction. And all this reform, it is about our strategy, our future. And anti-corruption reforms, defense reform, decentralization, education, reform in healthcare, everything about how to Ukraine be more efficient, how to improve our governance, how to be closer to European Union standards. So now, obviously, this we go in the one way, because before 2014, it was a long discussion, which way could be better for Ukraine, neutrality, not belonging to security organization in Europe, belong to Russia. After Russian aggression, everything stopped. Now you ask me about reforms. How is going now? Comparison is the previous time. I think it's absolutely wrong perception in many countries abroad. Comparison reforms during Zelensky time with Poroshenko time. Sometimes our government also use this stereotype, to compare with Poroshenko. No, we have to compare with Yanukovych period. We have to compare with the previous period when it was shaky. And it was Yanukovych who completely...
Let's compare with the Yanukovych period.
Yanukovych significantly grows.
On the police
45 positions.
What was attempted? Was attempted a cleanup on the Georgian model. What resulted, of course, at first they fired a significant number of people, and then those significant number of people, they hired new people, and then the old people mixed with the new eventually, and the whole thing stopped. So yes, we of course they compare.
No, not saying stop. Not saying stop. Now Zelensky continues this reform. Not exactly. And Avakov, who is the Minister of Interior,
but especially on this, not so much on education and healthcare, because all of these education, healthcare, and all the other great reforms, agriculture, anything you want, they all eventually will depend on the state of the corruption and on the state of the judiciary. In
Absolutely right.
Those two reforms, how would you assess the success by Poroshenko? Obviously, none of this could have been touched under Yanukovych, obviously, because that was very corrupt, absolutely corrupt government, and there was no talk about this. But under Poroshenko, those were the two hallmark reforms. How far did they go? And why do they have to be picked up again under Zelensky today?
You mentioned the main reform, police reform. It was beginning during Poroshenko, now continues during Zelensky. Maybe because also leadership of Arsen Avakov, who is still Minister of Interior. And I see this Arsen Avakov pretty successful in to have more budget for police in Ukraine. It's also political competition. It's not during the pandemic. He is finding resources for continuous police reform, and many countries support that. Decentralization. It did a lot of things during Poroshenko, Groisman, Yatsenyuk. It's not about president only. It's about the country, about the government. So it was beginning of the process, and I remember it was very difficult to begin. So Poroshenko did many things to begin. And some of experts abroad mentioned this is because pressure to Ukrainian leadership doing the reform. That's right, but it's not only about pressure. It's about the willingness of Ukrainians to change situation. And unfortunately, and not only Poroshenko, I also worked for 1 year in Kyiv in 2014-15 as deputy head of presidential administration. After that, as ambassador to the United States. I remember this. One of the challenge was we want to open the free access of Ukrainians to Europe. I mean, visa-free regime. And thanks, by the way, thank you very much. This France support that, and not only that, but also support Ukraine now in United Nations around the globe for against Russian aggression. Thank you so much for that. Free visa agreement or visa-free regime. 146 demands, not reforms. 146. Among them, changes in Ukrainian legislation need decision by the parliament. Many structural things, many technical things. Finally, after 1.5 years, having very good understanding what we should do, having common intensive work of all the bodies of Ukrainian government, we achieved it finally. And so let's just demonstrate. It is not about Poroshenko, not about Zelensky. It is about Ukraine. And I wanted to have the same enthusiastic approach now, because in 2014, I remember, I personally can say you, in presidential administration, I worked 16 hours every day for half a year, and all team worked on such intensive, dynamic way, because it was aggression, it was Russian attack, and we work on all these reforms. Now, from one hand, more opportunities for Zelensky, because Zelensky received a great support from Ukrainian people. In the same time, it is not only about anti-corruption measures, it's also about the quality of governance. So we crucial need improve our governance in Ukraine. It is not about some personalities. I recognize and appreciate the role of Taras Katchka or our new appointment, Ambassador Vadym Omelchenko, but it's about all the system, all the bureaucratic system of Ukraine. And now we face new problem because some of our politicians want to bring back Ukraine on the same track that we spent decades, I mean Russian track. It's easy model, not European model, but just how to make this easy. Restore energy supplies, gas supplies from Russia easily. Restore our trade with Russia. By the way, Russia can't be trade, not Ukraine. We have to restore all the broadcasting of Russian TV channels in Ukraine and everything that bring back us to Russia. And Ukrainian society, who has spent a lot of energy, resources during Maidan, during the war with Russia, not change this direction, now frustrated. So it is not about the only presidents, it's about Ukrainian society. Civil society play significant role. Yeah.
A lot
now
of
I finalize this.
Foreign influence, but of course we have seen and we have witnessed, of course, from the West. I think that wasn't lost on the West, that in Ukraine, what 2014 has shown, just as 2005 before it, that Ukrainian civil society was much more mature than the Ukrainian elites, and that is, of course, the major kind of lesson and takeaway. Thank you so much for this.
I want to finalize what we need.
Right back.
We need to understanding how we achieve this result, because we we are most successful country in the post-Soviet phase. And all things that happen in Russia depend of us, of Ukraine.
Thank you so much. We're going to get right back to you during Q&A. It's not the last remark, promise. We're just now going to turn to the situation, of course, which resulted from the whole transition of power in Ukraine, and which wasn't pretty much partly caused by it, and then caused by other factors, of course, independent from the transition of power there. But we're going to now turn to the conflict with Russia, to the situation in the east of the country of Ukraine, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, parts of it, which are now occupied and or taken under the control, which is not Ukrainian government control. The Ukrainian government does not control the border. The conflict has resulted in about 14,000 dead on Ukrainian side, 40,000 casualties, including civilians and military. We have a pleasure to welcome today Benoit Paré, who is part of the OSCE monitoring mission, a special monitoring mission in the east of Ukraine, and who has before had a military career, starting with the French Ministry of Defense and then going through a series of the observer missions in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Lebanon. Thank you so much, Benoit, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Introductory remarks about the mission itself, what it is, and then explain to us how the situation is on the ground, the living conditions for the people in the occupied territories, the chiefs of these occupied territories, and then from your point of view, how the government actually is happening there. What is the currency there? What's the job situation? What is the situation? And then your view maybe on the whole negotiation process and the progress that has been achieved either by Ukraine side or the lack of progress as you see it from there, and also from the perspective of the people there, and who do they associate with eventually? Is it Russia? Is it Ukraine? Is it just indifference and the whole struggle for survival? Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. It's many things in 10 minutes, but I'll try to be brief. First, going back to the mandate of the OSCE mission there, the special monitoring mission to Ukraine. Its mandate goes back to March 2014. That was before actually the military conflict in Donbass. Now, this mandate specified that the OSCE mission was supposed to monitor the situation on the ground, and I'm reading, and was supposed to contribute to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability, and security. And this under the principles of impartiality and transparency. I insist on impartiality. It was one of the key principles we had to respect as OSCE observers on the ground. We were supposed to establish and report facts in response to specific incidents, and also monitor the situation of the regarding human rights and fundamental freedoms. That was the mandate. Then we had the Minsk agreements that came on top of that from 2015, and as part of the Minsk agreements, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission was specifically tasked to monitor different aspects of these agreements, those dealing with the withdrawal of heavy weapons, but also the violations of the ceasefire. Right? These two items were like constant topics on the missions of the daily patrols of the SMM. Now going back to your questions, basically every morning in the east, in Donbass, OSCE monitors, first they go through a training in which they are told about what happened over the last 24 hours. It's mainly security information, and then they discuss the specific plan of the patrol for that day. And then you have patrols going out in the field with different tasks, trying to talk to the local population, having feedback from them about what's going on, their feelings, their problems. We'll talk about also to local authorities. We talk to military representatives that we can encounter on the ground, all kinds of actors that are relevant. And then at the end of the day, the patrols go back, write patrol reports. These patrol reports are then read by a specific service reporting unit, which basically builds the mission daily report after several filters, because first you have the patrol, then the team level, and then head office, and then it's the public report that is available for the media and everybody else. It's a long process. Many people work, and the daily report is finished on the following day, usually, after the initial patrols. Now, also, the OSCE mission there consists of 57 member states. Now, that includes all Western countries, but also all the post-USSR countries, former USSR countries, including Ukraine, of course, but also Russia. So within the same organization, you have both Americans and Russians, for instance, right? So it's a specific situation, and we have Americans and Russians colleagues and Europeans of all different countries, and we have to work together, knowing that each country has a different agenda and a sometimes completely different view of the conflict. So that's part of the challenge. You know, every single monitor who we send there actually is aware of that, and everybody's briefed about the fact that, okay, we need to work together, and the fact that we have to respect the principles of impartiality in our daily work and in our observations helps basically to make the whole thing work. Russian citizens, I know it was discussed a lot about their role in the mission. Truth is, none of them during the almost 5 years I was in this mission had any position of influence. Meaning none of them was a manager, none of them was in the reporting chain. So that really reduced their role to a kind of minimum. So now talking about the local population on the spot, basically I was myself deployed first of all in government control areas in Kramatorsk, then in Mariupol, but I also had a chance to patrol regularly on the other side in Holivka area, for instance, or also a bit in Donetsk and more in the southern part of your Donetsk Oblast. So I had a chance to see the situation at the start from 2015 when I was there, and then how it evolved throughout the years. Now in 2015, it was Donetsk city, for instance, was pretty empty. It was pretty striking. There were very few people in the street, few people in shops, but at the same time, you had an impression of normalcy somehow because everything was quiet. You had public transportation running, you had open restaurants, even though less than before. But okay, it was general impression was like very low level of activity still. And of course, I mean, in Donetsk, I mean, you could hear shelling from time to time because it was very close to the line of contact. Then I moved to Luhansk city from the end of 2018. And then I was living there permanently for 18 months. And again, I saw another evolution there, meaning that little by little, we saw more and more people in the streets, even traffic jams. I mean, I was talking to people who said that in 2015, it was unthinkable to have traffic jams in Luhansk city. But in 2019 and 20, you started to have traffic jams at the rush hour, which was a sign that more and more people had come back and had some kind of activity, some kind of work. Basically, we knew that from the stages of the armed conflict, when it was very intense, I'm talking about 2014 up to February 15, right? But until the Minsk agreement was signed, basically, conflict was intense, and Minsk 2, I should say, specify, Minsk 2 in February. But then they had some kind of stabilization of the front line to start with. Front line got stabilized on there, with little incidents, more or less, all along the way, but nothing significant over the next few years. And therefore, little by little, it allowed for some people to come back. Now, what kind of population did we have there? I mean, initially, mostly the elderly. The vast majority of people who didn't go anywhere were the elderly people. And also, I mean, you see that in other conflicts. It's not specific to Ukraine, but I mean, the old people, in terms of war, actually, they are very reluctant to leave the area where they have spent all their life. I mean, you could find the same phenomena in Nagorno-Karabakh or areas like that. Everywhere you find the same phenomenon. They're left behind, basically. And this is why also for them, the fact that it was no longer possible for them to get their pensions from the Ukrainian government. Now they had to cross the line of contact to get pensions. But it was a big hassle for them to do that. Then you have a part of the population that stayed behind who was, let's say, opposed to the government in Kyiv. And so they decided to stay behind and they wanted to have their children educated in Russian. So that was one of the reasons why they stayed behind. But how many people, what is the percentage of the population we're talking about? It's hard to say. Nobody has precise statistics. From what I gathered in 2014, 15, more than 2/3 of the population left in the countryside, especially near the line of contact. Some villages were almost totally deserted. But then little by little, people came back because they didn't have economic opportunities where they ended up for many of them. It was not easy to find a job, either in the rest of Ukraine or in Russia. It was not easy for them. So they came back because, they thought, well, it was at least in what the Ukrainian government calls the occupied territories, well, at least they had a house or they had an apartment of their own they didn't have to pay for. It was theirs. So Okay, they prefer to come back. I had very little occasions actually to engage in political discussions with people there, ordinary people, I mean, in that, because usually they're cautious. They don't talk so easily to foreigners.
Maybe you've seen, because we've heard reports of, a lot of racketeering, property expropriation, people basically subject to violence from the hands of the local new authorities, if you want, new commanders, which was a mix of people from the Caucasus, special forces, the local gangs who've been there forever, the new coming gangs who came from somewhere else across the border, and then all type of violence erupted, and even till this day, from the reports of OSCE and the UN observer mission, also there we read that there is violence is kind of exists for it's difficult to do business, to kind of have a daily life, and then it's we read also that the industrial means of production, like the industrial complex pieces characteristic for the region, have been literally taken apart, taken to pieces, and basically exported somewhere. And how does that impact the employment? Where do people actually work? Was there a time when the only employment opportunity was to take a machine gun and to go and shoot somebody because that was the only paying job, or was that not
Well, I think we have to make distinctions between the early stages of the conflict and the later stages. In the early stages in 2014, I'm talking about, I was not there, I specify, but from, various accounts of either local people or colleagues, it was a bit of a Far West, and it was a bit chaotic. And it is the era where the most violations of human rights were committed by far. But, with time, actually the structures in these occupied territories, they started to get more organized and try to impose some kind of order, their order, but still some kind of order. And therefore, life resumed with a certain level of normalcy. I don't agree that, like Luhansk city, for instance, where I was, is a city where you can have your throats cut at every corner. No, it's not that. You have an impression of normalcy once again. But violence is more hidden. Violence would, state violence in this case, if I can call that state, let's say official violence, or the violence of the structures, is something more hidden, done by the security services. And they would target specific individuals whom they would suspect of spying or whatever. And this can occur, all of a sudden like this. Even people of their own structures, because they had faced internal power struggles, both in Donetsk region and Luhansk region. They had internal power struggles, and sometimes people who were in a position of power within their own structures could one day become almost enemies. Actually, when I was in Luhansk, I was part of a small unit specifically dedicated to report on the human rights violations. That was very specific, and we had various people coming to us, to our office, to complain about various things. And I personally interviewed people, family members of civilians who were actually part of these structures. And all of a sudden, because there was a change of power, they fell in disgrace, and they found themselves arrested and put into jail. And then the family had no news and were wondering what's going on, and they were afraid, and so forth. And also in the LPR structures, for instance, they had a specific law which says that they could keep in detention anybody for 60 days without need to justify themselves, without seeing a lawyer or whatever. We had many people actually who came to us who had family members who were arrested and kept in detention for 60 days. And families usually were very stressed because they had very little news or no news at all. Now, we were communicating with the UN mission over there. They had more access than we had because they could write letters to the local structures there, and when the OSCE leadership would not allow us to do that. So the local structures would not agree to meetings oftentimes unless we would write a letter saying we would like to have a meeting to discuss this and that. So I say, okay, send us a letter. Okay, we don't send a letter, no meetings. So we found ourselves in this kind of limbo for years, actually. It was very frustrating. But the UN didn't have this obstacle.
We're going. Thank you very much for this insight and for telling us a bit kind of how things are. We're going now to have to turn to questions as I see the clock turn.
Yeah.
One is going to be about economics. Just I'll come back to this maybe more for Taras Katchka at first, and then maybe other people would like to join in. Clearly, the turn toward Europe and the Western, pivot, so to say, of Ukraine has increased trade with the European Union, and trade with Russia has diminished. And yet, we know that in some areas it went basically to zero at a certain point. The whole gas supplies had to be rerouted through Europe. But in other areas, the trade has continued, or either through partnerships or through the existing foreign direct investment, or through the cooperation within certain fields, either scientific fields, or what are the areas where the cooperation still exists? And can we say that Europe has truly replaced Russia as the main economic partner of Ukraine?
We have, in the pandemic time, we have dropping of our trade with all countries, and including the United States, as I was responsible 1 year ago as ambassador. But if you compare last year's, after 2014, we significantly increased our trade with France and with the European Union. Problem for Ukraine is the structure of our exports, because structure is a mineral resources, it's a chemical resources, it's a mineral resources. It's good, we'll discuss lithium, as we now discuss, and President Zelensky invite Mr. Musk to Ukraine with this reason, to attend Museum of Cosmonauts of Ukraine. But, it's maybe future. But now we have real structure. Agriculture, steel remain very important for Europe as suppliers of agricultural resources. It's like a European basket in the former times. You remember, Ukraine was named as European basket for agriculture. And more importantly, we produce very poor ecological agricultural products. And this is good news. Also good news that we receive more machinery from France. So it's new technology. Maybe I've been criticized by some economists in Ukraine because it's also about our structure, but we have had many things from in military technical cooperation. We buy France helicopters, we buy France ships, and now we plan to produce together ships with France and Ukrainian manufacturers. So we increase our trade in a very concrete domains, mostly connected to defense and security and agriculture. So that's a picture.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Another question, maybe to continue a little bit on the economic theme, but also tied to the occupied territories. One of Zelensky's electoral campaign promises was the economic development of the LNR and the DNR regions, so the occupied territories. What has been done in this regard, and what are the examples applied to this economic development policies in there, for example? I know that maybe this is more toward Vadym Omelchenko also. I'd like to hear your thoughts about this, because we know that President Zelensky invited President Macron to come to Ukraine. There are hopes for maybe agreements and more French businesses in Ukraine. And also President Zelensky came to France, and during his visit here, he visited innovative, let's say, structures like Station F, where it's an accelerator with the startups. And how much has Zelensky advanced in this promise, the economic restoration, so to say, around this region, and how much can Europe and maybe France even help him in this regard, because some French companies were targeted specifically for that investment? Maybe Vadym Omelchenko?
Я хотів би сказати, що дійсно планується візит президента Макрона в Україну.
Vous avez raison, cette information est connue. On travaille sur la préparation de la visite de président Macron en Ukraine.
Ми працюємо над цим кожного дня.
On travaille précisément tous les jours.
Понад усе над суттєвим наповненням порядку денного цього візиту.
Mais ce qui est important de dire qu'on ne travaille pas en vain, mais on travaille de faire en sorte de le remplir par le contenu substantiel.
Я хотів би додати, що останнє засідання змішаної комісії Україна-Франція
J'aimerais bien souligner que la réunion récente, les dernières réunions de la commission mixte économique entre France et l'Ukraine,
включав в себе 17 пунктів.
Il y avait 17 points d'agenda, paragraphes d'agenda qui étaient mis sur la table.
Кількість питань зростає з кожним засіданням.
Et les sujets sur la table, le nombre de sujets s'agrandit, s'élargit chaque jour.
І ми сподіваємося, що під час візиту президента Франції в Україну будуть підписано декілька дуже важливих і масштабних контрактів.
En faire en sorte, et on croise les doigts, que lors de la visite du président Macron à Kiev, il y a certains de ces arrangements, de ces contrats qui vont être signés, qui sont réciproquement bénéficiels pour nos deux pays.
Це передусім великий контракт з компанією Alstom.
Bien évidemment, c'est pas un secret, il s'agit de grands contrats avec Alstom
І урядом України.
et le gouvernement ukrainien.
З постачання електровозів,
Ce qui concerne la fourniture des locomotives françaises
який передбачає локалізацію в Україні також.
qui va être déployé en Ukraine.
Ми також сподіваємося, що ми встигнемо працювати питання щодо розширення співробітництва з компанією Alstom.
Et on espère aussi qu'on aura assez le temps avant la visite d'élargir le spectre de notre coopération avec Alstom aussi.
Щодо будівництва залізничних швидкоскоростних шляхів між Києвом і Львовом, Києвом і Одесою.
Il s'agit de projets de la construction de lignes de train de grande vitesse entre Kiev et Lviv et Kiev et Odessa avec l'appui français.
Це контракти з будування станції питної води.
Et bien évidemment, le projet sur l'eau potable qui est fait avec l'engagement français.
Така станція вже побудована в Маріуполі.
Il s'agit de projets à Mariupol.
Це десятки мільйонів євро.
C'est des dizaines de millions d'euros.
І ми сподіваємося, що також почнеться таке будівництво в Києві і Луганську.
Et on aussi envisage de pouvoir déployer ces projets à Kiev et à Luhansk.
Thank you very much. Very hopeful contracts. Hopefully they come true. Now, maybe a few questions coming up in the chat about Donbass and the state of the conflict. How would you characterize the conflict today? Would you say that it has entered the frozen stage because the shooting has gone down, especially since the signing of the latest ceasefire agreement in July, which has been holding with relevant success? Or would you say that it is too early to classify it this way? Whose interest would be such a classification of the frozen conflict there? And how would it impact the resolution of the conflict? And another question, just an annex to this, and then I'll let you, Mr. Omelchenko, just speak right away, is how the passportization of the LNR, DNR population influence or complicates the resolution of this conflict?
Ну, по-перше, хотів би сказати, що я ніколи не чув від президента Зеленського, що Україна має намір заморозити цей конфлікт.
Et tout d'abord, je veux souligner avec beaucoup de points d'acclamation que je n'ai jamais entendu parler de la part du président Zelensky que c'est dans l'intérêt de l'Ukraine de geler ce conflit.
Єдина річ, яку прагне Україна,
La seule chose que l'Ukraine veut atteindre,
це відновити контроль над кордоном
c'est de restaurer le contrôle sur notre frontière
і звільнити нашу територію від агресії.
et d'occuper et libérer notre territoire des conséquences de l'agression.
Що стосується припинення вогню, я вважаю, що тут ніхто не ставить під сумнів те, що це досягнення, безумовно.
En ce qui concerne la cessez-le-feu, je pense qu'il n'y a personne qui va mettre en question le fait que c'est un beau but, c'est un accomplissement, c'est une réussite et un succès de.
Воно триває безпрецедентно майже 6 місяців.
Ça fait 7 mois que ça dure.
І кожний день припинення вогню – це збереження життя українців.
Et on comprend bien que chaque journée de cessez-le-feu dans cette façon ou une autre, ça peut être retranscrit comme les vies sauvées, comme les vies pas perdues.
На жаль, в перемовинах щодо нормандського формату ми рухаємось дуже повільно.
Malheureusement, en ce qui concerne les négociations au format de Normandie, on n'avance pas trop.
Тут би я хотів процитувати міністра закордонних справ Франції Місьє Дріана.
C'est pour ça que j'aimerais bien citer là le ministre des Affaires étrangères français, M. Jean-Yves Le Drian,
який сказав, що єдина стратегія Росії в зовнішніх стосунках – це блокування.
qui a dit que le seul stratégie que la Russie a dans cette relation extérieure, dans ce dossier extérieur, c'est le blocage.
Це стосується також питання Криму і Донбасу.
C'est la même chose qui concerne Crimée et Donbass.
Що стосується паспортизації.
En ce qui concerne l'issue de passeport, la passeportisation.
Це дуже негативний, дестабілізуючий, деструктивний фактор.
C'est un facteur destructif, déstabilisant.
Я хотів би сказати, що ця гібридна стратегія вже застосовувалась Росією в Абхазькому конфлікті, Придністровському конфлікті.
Et c'est la même stratégie hybride qui était utilisée par les Russes en Ossétie et Transnistrie.
Нічого нового тут немає, але це деструктивна річ.
Rien de nouveau, c'est très destructif et efficace.
Яка віддаляє будь-які сподівання на мирне врегулювання.
Qui éloigne les espoirs de avancer vite vers le règlement pacifique.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the comments. Benoit, Paré, please.
Just a quick word regarding the passportization. I mean, we actually followed that closely when I was on the spot and trying to understand what was going on and who was benefiting from this measure. I mean, it was like obvious that the first people who were prioritized in getting those passports were those who were already members of the administrations that were running these occupied territories. They were on the priority list to receive these Russian passports, as well as the members of the armed groups. And we are talking here about tens of thousands of people altogether, probably more. And then you had a second category of people. I mean, for these people, I forgot to mention, it was kind of a way to give them possibility to get out should Ukraine take control back of the area, because many feared that they would be arrested if the area was going back under Ukrainian control, as is the goal, right? So it was kind of them for some kind of insurance. Okay, if Ukraine comes back, we can flee to Russia and live there. Because that's one thing. Second thing, there are many people also in these territories who ordinary people who actually work in Russia, and usually they are men and they leave their families behind, wife and children, and they come back every 3 months because there is an issue of visa, and then they go back again to work. And so many of them thought if they had a Russian passport, it would facilitate their life, and they wouldn't have to come back every 3 months just to be able to re-enter Russia and work again. So these were like the two target groups, let's say. Now, I'm not talking about the political dimension, talking about the down-to-earth consequences. Now, there was another question about Zolote. Should I cover that one?
Yes, please. This is very important also point, because when you mentioned the line and the crossing, just for make sure that everybody's on the same page, there are only 5 crossings along over 400 kilometers of the separation line. And that's the question, that also these crossings were dangerous, super difficult even physically. How has this situation, Zelensky's promised that they're going to be repaired, there are going to be improvements made?
Yeah, I mean, the main point was the Staniska-Luhanska, not Zolote. In Staniska-Luhanska, you had a broken bridge. That was actually the line of contact. That was the only way out of the occupied part of Lugansk Oblast to a Ukrainian-controlled part of the Oblast. This was only a way people could go, was through this broken bridge. And it was very difficult for the elderly people to go back and forth, and they had to go on average once a month to collect their pension. And lots of people were falling sick. I mean, we had many people who died on the spot because of the weather conditions, because it was too cold or it was too hot. So it is one of the major achievements of
just to pass, basically.
Just to pass, because actually it's not just passing, it's you have to wait in line both ways for hours, because it takes time to control people, to control what they have in their bags and so forth. So people had to queue for hours and hours in whatever the weather conditions. And for the elderly people, that some of them actually called that torture. I mean, I heard that myself from different people who were lining up there. What was one of the major achievements of President Zelensky was to actually allow the reconstruction of a new pedestrian bridge that would facilitate the crossing for the elderly people. Because also with the old bridge, they had to go down a wooden ramp and then go up another wooden ramp, and it was very slippery in winter. It was cause of fear and stress and sometimes minor accident. This was solved during the last summer of 2020, and the new bridge was reopened, I believe it was in September, if not mistaken, of 2020. So on this specific points, there was improvement. Now the question was about Zolote. Zolote is a different location in the same oblast where the Ukrainian government would like to open a new crossing point for vehicles this time, because in Luhansk is just for pedestrians. But the LPR side always refused to open crossing. They want another place to allow for car traffic, which is near, that is closer to Luhansk, different location. And until I was there was a lack of agreement between both sides regarding which other crossing point to open. And this issue has been going on for years, as I will speak.
To just wrap up, because we're running short of time.
Yeah,
just
sure.
Maybe, if you had to conclude about the development of the situation there overall, not about specific maybe this or that spot, but overall, how do you see the situation going forward? This is the question to everybody, to all the speakers. Maybe just within just in a few sentences, the 1 minute, under 1 minute. How do you see the situation going forward? What are the prospects? And how do you assess that?
Regarding the issue of frozen conflict, as I heard, I mean, indeed, I was surprised when I read the comment in the chat, because indeed, I haven't heard that the president of Ukraine would actually say that in these terms. Maybe there was a misinterpretation. I think what he may have meant is that what he calls a frozen conflict is the fact that there is no more ceasefire violations along the front line. Maybe this is what was meant, and behind the expression frozen conflict. And I believe it is an achievement if people don't shoot and shell along the line of contact, because it was completely sterile during the time I was there. It was just causing suffering for no gain. So it's a big achievement if at least we couldn't, I mean, the side on the spot can manage to stop the armed dimension of the conflict. Now there remains the political side of the conflict. This is the whole other issue, and I prefer not to start discussing about that because it would be too long.
But just maybe in a few words, like that being the difficult issue, and of course so far unsolvable, the solution of the Minsk agreements. But under 1 minute, how would you characterize going forward? How would you see this? Noting these achievements that you have and others have underlined, right, under Zelensky administration. So the ceasefire, which is holding on so far for the first time, the improvements in the so-called along the border infrastructure, the plans to then implant, real economic development, plans for economic development at least, and then the continuous negotiations, and which even though slow, how would you just maybe very shortly, how do you see it going forward? And then same question for Vadym Omelchenko for...
we can go back to the Minsk agreements. When I was deployed in Ukraine in 2015, Minsk agreement was like the document of reference. And the idea was to implement this agreement. The first blockage on the political side came when the Ukrainian parliament on the 30th of August 2015 failed to adopt the change of the constitution. Actually, the initial law to actually grant a special status to the territories in Donbass was approved by a simple majority, but for it to become law the Ukrainian government was supposed to change the constitution, which needed a 2/3 majority. It never could actually, under the Poroshenko administration, manage to have this 2/3 majority. Now with the Zelensky administration in power, it seems that, after all, Ukrainian elites don't want the Minsk agreement anymore. And now they say we need to change it, we need to renegotiate it, because it appears for them too much of a concession to change the constitution to allow these territories in Donbass to have a special status. That's the political deadlock on the Ukrainian side. I don't think the Russian side, from everything I've heard, is willing to renegotiate Minsk. So where do we go from there? That's the open question. I don't know.
Your vision of the future is rather difficult. It's rather stalemate. Thank you so much, Benoit Paré, for taking the time. Maybe the same question: how do you see the situation going forward on the conflict and the conflict resolution? Either Vadym Omelchenko or Valery Chali.
Just respond for Mr. Benoit mentioned now, because I belong to this team in Minsk, and all meetings with President Hollande and Chancellor Merkel during 2014 to 2015. It's not all true. First of all, I would like to thank SMM, OSCE, for great job, and it's really it's a man job. It's not easy to secure a situation in such a hot conflict. It is a hot conflict. It is not frozen conflict, and not in the interest of Ukraine to make it frozen. Its interest maybe another side. Another thing, we do not have ceasefire. That's important point. Because last year we lose more than 80 killed and more than 350 wounded. So it's definitely not the ceasefire. And I wanted to remind Mr. Benoit the situation in 2015, when we did a lot of things from our side, despite of Ukrainian society was absolutely against these political steps. First decision in the parliament on amnesty, decision on a possible amnesty, decision about so-called special status, but it's a specifics of governance in this Donetsk and Luhansk territories. What we receive in response? We receive artillery shelling. And that's the most problem, because means mostly, I know that, I participated in negotiation and Minsk about ceasefire. The first point, despite all the different other points, this Russian delegation was insist doing in the first, the political first, no, security first. And that's a discussion that continues, Ukraine, can you imagine France discussion with anybody who occupied part of your territory? We can discuss everything. We can discuss pension. We can discuss humanitarian aspects. We can and thank you for OSCE. They help us a lot in this situation. But we will never discuss our sovereignty. We will never discuss our territorial integrity. And I am witness how Russian officers, Russian soldiers shooting, shelling on Ukrainian villages in 2014. I was those who spoke to international community as a foreign policy advisor with my colleagues with our security service, and bringing Russian tanks to our memorial. We have museum in Kyiv, in downtown Kyiv. We bring Russian tanks, Russian machinery, just demonstrate that they killed our people. So that's why we need to understand all steps from Ukraine can be possible if Russia makes something. Russia did nothing. And that's a conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It's not a conflict with our citizens. I want to remind you, we have 1.5 million, almost 2 million internal displaced persons. Please not forget about them. And Ukraine paid a lot of money for all these citizens and still pay pensions. Can you imagine? Sometimes there's guys who is in control and, absolutely controlled by Kremlin. They receive pension. I have seen one of the interesting but video. And one of these guys, who is a keep machine gun, say, I am a former Soviet from Ukraine. He was born in Ukraine. I was former Soviet soldiers. Please give me my Soviet pension. And after that, journalists ask him, but you will still fight against Kyiv? Yes. So very complete situation. And what we need to do in this situation? We need to bring to responsibility, or Putin or Russia doing something. Ukraine and President Zelensky, we see, very open, just making many steps. In Ukrainian society, very often it's named like a not compromise, but capitulation. And sometimes it is not like a backstep from Ukrainian side and other sides, but it's like a one-way compromise, one-way steps. So we need by way or by road steps. That's simply. And with thanks for French leadership and German leadership for mediation of that, for support us with pushing Russia doing something, just restore peace and sovereignty of Ukraine.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chale, for your comments. Vadym Omelchenko, your thoughts going forward, what do you see? And you have the concluding word.
Pour terminer, je voudrais vous raconter une histoire. J'ai un ami qui est enseignant de Sciences Po, que vous connaissez bien, et il a fait avec son étudiant, il a fait un jour un brainstorming avec une question. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait pour résoudre ce problème au Donbass? Et alors, les étudiants, il a pensé tous les jours, et ils sont divisés pour les groupes, et après, dans son rapport, ils ont dit une solution, une chose qu'on voudrait dire, que cette situation dépend d'une seule personne, c'est Poutine. Et voilà, c'est une vérité, et je suis ravi que les étudiants français connaissent. Malgré tout, on ne peut pas dépendre d'une seule personne. Et alors, j'espère très fort pour cette prochaine summit au niveau des présidents. Et on est prêt pour beaucoup de compromis, pour nombreux de compromis, sauf question de notre souveraineté.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much to all of our speakers, Vadym Omelchenko, Valery, Benoit, Paré, and Katchka. Thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you for the audience, everybody who attended, who came join us on Zoom, on Facebook Live. And thank you for the brilliant team of organizers, great technical support, solution of all of the technical problems, and making this happen. Thank you to the translator also very much, the interpreter who was working very hard. It was an intense session. Thank you. And to the editorial team who prepared this issue of the Eastern Circles. Thank you. And we'll see you next month for our next event on Armenia. Stay well. Bye-bye.
Bye.